Tonight's speaker is Juan Enriquez, talking about Redesigning Humanity, Evolution 2.0. So Juan is a leading authority on the economic impact of life sciences and brain research on business and society, as well as an entrepreneur. He was the founding director of Harvard Business School's Life Sciences Project. He was a research affiliate at MIT's Synthetic Neurobiology Lab. And then he founded Excel Venture Management and helped build the world's first synthetic life form, programmable cells, RNA desktop printers, stapled peptides, and portable MRI readers. Other than that, what have you done for us? Right? As a business leader and a renowned speaker, Juan builds companies and works with the CEOs of a number of Fortune 50 companies, as well as various heads of state, on how to adapt to a world where the dominant language is shifting from the digital toward the language of life. He's the author and co-author of multiple bestsellers, and he's a TED All-Star. So thank you so much for being with us today.
So we're going to start with the very short term. We're going to go into what happened over the last few years. Then we're going to go into what's happening now, and then we're going to get way into the long now. So let's start with today. Today is not looking good. Could we move this light? Is that feasible? Just so the screen. The first thing to understand in this stuff is just how unusual these times are. Because for centuries, if you wanted to predict the future, you stepped out of the cave and you knew the savannah was there, and you knew the animals were there, and it was the same animals, and you knew that the rains were going to come, and then you knew that the dry season was going to come, and you knew a lion might eat you, and every once in a while somebody may come and try and kill you. But it was pretty easy to predict the past, right? Because you looked at the last 50 years, and almost everything that was going to happen to you had happened over the last 50 years. Maybe every once in a while you get an eclipse or something outrageous, and people would freak out. So for 99.9% of history, nothing moved. And we forget that. And we just don't understand how unusual these times are and what these times mean. And so now, as the movie says, everything seems to be happening everywhere all at once. And you can see what a difference 6 months make, right? In literally 6 months, we go from being the envy of the world in America's economy to being a dollar crisis to being what's happening today, which is, anyway, we're not going to go into today, except to say that we're back in the Crusades, right? So we're now waging a religious war against Islam. And, you know, that might have consequences, because that might go beyond a single country. We've seen this movie before, and it doesn't end well. So things everywhere seem to be chasing faster and faster. And in the context of that, one of the things I've been doing for the past 4 years is trying to write a book on why bother having children. Because to have children, it's the ultimate act of faith. You're going to bring kids into a world, and hopefully they're A, going to survive, and B, do better than you are. And as you're thinking about that structure, you're bringing them into a world where the time to impact of a technology is shortening and shortening and shortening. So the time to adoption of, call it 90% of the population of various technologies, keeps getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And what the digital world, what many of you in this room are doing, because this is a pretty extraordinary room in terms of who's in it, is this stuff is going vertical. So you're getting almost vertical adoption of some of these technologies, right? Time to 1 million people using this thing is measured in weeks. Time to 100 million is measured in months. And you've never seen that before in human history, and we're living in Cambridge, and so we kind of live that, and we think that's normal. It ain't normal, kids, right? Evolution's not set up for this stuff. So with so much discombobulation, at the time that all these breaking alerts are hitting your phones, and all these interesting things are happening, we keep forgetting that we're living in times of miracle and wonder. These are really unusual times. And there ain't a lot of people out there telling you there is actually stuff that is very cool that's going on. And when you look at things like child mortality under 5 years old in the United States, it looks pretty darn good. When you look at murder rates throughout history, it looks pretty darn good. By the way, child mortality rate at least according to official statistics, are now lower in Russia than they are in the United States. If you look at what mobile phones do, this is a very different period of time, right? Because I certainly didn't grow up with mobile phones, even though I'm ancient. Some of you may not have grown up with mobile phones, but the implication of having a smartphone across, call it 8.2 billion mobile subscribers, let me say that again, 8.2 billion mobile subscribers, means that you've got an average of 10.7 phones per 10 people on the planet. And what does it mean to have a mobile phone? Having a mobile phone, unlike when I was in college and when I was in graduate school, means that you are carrying the Library of Alexandria to the 10th power, the 100th power in your pocket. Right? These are the largest libraries ever conceived of by human beings, and you've got them in your pocket and you take it for granted. And you've got the Tower of Babel, because you can now translate real-time anything just using Google Translate. And you can do it writing, you can do it speaking, wherever. You've got that. Now you've got earphones that from your phone can translate conversations real-time, and you can speak into the thing and they can hear you in their language. And then you've got free global communications. For some of us, we used to be on the phone and you'd get interrupted. Long distance calling, do you want to hang up? Right? That's inconceivable to any child today. And then you've got price transparency. Well, you can check out prices anywhere in the world for anything. And I can give you a list of 100 other things. Each of these things will have been considered the most valuable thing in the world, the most valuable company in the world across all time. And today we just take it kind of for granted that we're carrying this in our pocket. And, it costs you $1,000 to have access, or maybe 500, or maybe 400. But that's pretty darn cheap for this stuff. And so as you're looking at the structure, I was on a call with Ariel a couple of months ago, and it was a bunch of Fortune 50 CEOs, and she smiled in her kind way, and she said, "What's your space strategy?" And they all kind of looked like, "What?" But of course, by the end of the talk, she'd convinced them all they actually needed a space strategy and they needed it now. And so as you're thinking of how fast this stuff is moving and the stuff that is being generated out of these 2 square miles, it's a pretty extraordinary time of miracle and wonder that we take for granted every day. That leads me to good old Roy Amara, who used to argue that we used to overestimate the impact of a technology in the short run and underestimate it in the long run. What technology in the past few decades has been overhyped and now is underestimated? And I would argue that there's a bunch of them, but one of the big ones is life sciences. Because there was all this hype about the human genome, we're going to have the gene sequence and you're going to do this and you're going to do that. I was part of that. But since that hype, we've been building a bunch of stuff. And it's stuff that works. And it's stuff that is getting cheap. And it's stuff that's getting deployed. So while everybody's watching AI, and certainly a lot to watch on AI, and while everybody's watching wars and everything else, this life science stuff is playing through. And as the life science stuff plays through, reading and writing life code is becoming a big deal. But we're not talking about it, right? And so one way to talk about that stuff is to ask the question, if Darwin was alive today, would he write the same books? Well, that's an interesting question. So what was Darwin's thesis? Well, under Darwin, for 4 billion years, nature ran the show, right? And it was based on 2 big drivers of what lived and what died and what got created and what didn't. Natural selection, random mutation. By the way, they don't believe it at today's Pentagon. That's a different version of evolution. But as you're thinking of this stuff, what does that mean? It means this thing got eaten or this thing didn't get eaten. This thing was cute enough to mate, this thing was not cute enough to mate. This thing was smart enough to find food, this thing was not smart enough to find food. So there was a lot of natural selection going on. And then every once in a while, somebody came up with a pink feather, and that became more attractive, and so pink feathers started to spread. One of the mutations in humans occurred about 11,000 years ago by the Black Sea, and some people liked it, so it spread, and that is called blue eyes. So blue eyes did not exist before 10,000 years ago, but they turn out to be popular with some people. So that runs the show. And that determines what lives and dies on this planet. And now what's happening is half of life is evolving through unnatural selection. So what the hell is unnatural selection? Unnatural selection is humans decide, this is what I want. This is how I'm going to change things. And human selection, unnatural selection, has been taking place for a while. So the Egyptians were making wine, and the French were making cheese, and we forget how totally, completely unnatural these products are. Because you do not go hiking through New Hampshire to find a lake of wine. And you do not go to Maine and find a tree of camembert, or a tree of roquefort, or a tree of cheddar, right? These are things that for thousands of years humans have been saying, if I alter nature in this way, I will produce something that I want. And as agriculture goes forward, we've been doing that for a long time, so what we've been doing with breeding is we've been taking wild mustard weed, and if you suppress mustard weed flowers, you get broccoli. And if you go out there and you get bigger leaves in mustard weed, then you get kale. And if you sterilize the mustard weed flowers, then you get cauliflower. So next time you go to All Foods and go to the all natural food section, that's bullshit. All right? This has been selective breeding of people saying, I don't like teosinte, which is about yay big. I like corn, which is about yay big. And you take 3,000 varieties of potatoes and corn, and you turn them into 2 or 3 varieties, which is what you like and the size you want. That is tasteless, but anyway. So humans run the show for half that show because they're doing this natural breeding and stuff. And then it accelerates. Remember those curves I showed at the beginning where this stuff compresses? Okay, well then you take a long time to breed this kind of cheese, or you take a long time to breed the Cabernet Sauvignon grape, or you take a long time to breed, X rye or bourbon. Now what happens is you're also getting non-random mutations. And that's the second purpose. Because what that does is it accelerates how this happens. Right? You used to breed 2 roses together, and those 2 roses would become a new rose, and you'd name it after somebody or whatever. Well, now you're doing it in a different fashion, right? So when you introduce non-random mutation in addition to natural selection, you first have to know the code. And so first you figure out, how is this coded? How is this written? And so these 2 characters plus Rosalind Franklin go out and begin to argue that all life forms are coded in 4 letters in DNA, and you can write it out as sentences. And in the measure that you understand how it's written, you map the genomes, you can edit the genomes. And editing the genomes is a big deal, right? Because now you don't just have the map, you can change the sentence. It's like a word processing. So you can change I love you to I hate you, you get a different outcome. And that means that you can alter the code of an orange to become a lemon, to become a grapefruit, to become a tangerine, or to become a vaccine. And of course, all of these things have been done because you're rewriting the genomes of these seeds. And then these 3 characters show up. And so what these characters do, besides winning the Nobel Prize, is they figure out how to do recombinant DNA. And so they figure out, hey, I can take this gene and insert it here and do something else. And there's a huge mess about this, right? The very colorful mayor of Cambridge, Al Bellucci, goes out and declares this is a threat to humanity and bans all recombinant DNA, and they go to Solomar and they put some rules in place, and then Bellucci says, oh, all right. And then Cambridge becomes the center of the world for this stuff. Right, literally, because after Solomar and these 3 guys' discovery, then you start getting all the companies that are sitting basically around here. And all the big pharmaceuticals are here. Right? The headquarters for research for Novartis and Sanofi and Biogen. These are big monster companies being created and moving here. And here's the reason why. Because evolution used to work on the top level. You would have one bacteria that would gradually evolve into another bacteria, and it would have no eyes, and it would have 1 eye for a series of generations, and it would have 2 eyes, and then go back to 1 eye, then it would go back to 2 eyes, and then eventually it would have some other traits, but it took a long time for these things to happen. And then you had to selectively breed to get those things in place. And what recombinant DNA did is basically it said, hey, stop, insert, go, move, right? And so that's short-circuiting evolution and allowing you to insert genes deliberately at scale faster. And then CRISPR shows up and all bets are off, right? Because then you get scissors and you get Jennifer Doudna and company coming in and basically saying, hey, insert this one and this one and this one, and you begin wholesale directing evolution at scale, at speed. And A, sequences that wouldn't have come in here are now coming in here. And B, you're getting a very fast cell evolution. Stuff that would have taken hundreds of thousands of years or thousands of years is now occurring in thousands of hours. And now hundreds of hours. And now tens of hours. And as this stuff starts to happen, then you begin to understand that life is code, it can be mapped, it can be programmed, and it's happened in one person's lifetime. So when you look at those examples of the Wright, people were alive when the Wright brothers launched their plane, and people were alive when somebody landed on the moon, yeah, you're watching that in a faster compressed space. So when you think about this stuff, it begins to have real effect on human health and what humans are and how they work. So you get these things when you're conceived. You're conceived, your mother and father's sperm and egg come together, you get one cell, it's a pluripotent stem cell. And then it divides and you've got 2 pluripotent stem cells. And then it divides and you've got 4 pluripotent stem cells. For the first 16 divisions, every cell can become every part of your body. So all these cells are like skiers accumulating at the top of that mountain. And then what happens is they begin to differentiate. So they begin to say, I'm going to become this, or I'm going to become that, or I'm going to become that. So it's a little bit like a skier deciding to go down this path, and that path leads to neurons. And somebody else goes down here, and that becomes bone, and then you get a series of paths, and you can go into platelets, or you can go into macrophages, or you can go into T cells. And these guys over here go into the bowl and become muscle. But each of your cells still has your entire genome. So each of your cells still has basically 6.4 billion letters that make you you. It's just expressing a small part of that, what that particular cell program can do. And so what Yamanaka and company did, which was really important, is they built a ski lift. And they took 4 chemicals and they basically started applying it to cells, and those cells reprogrammed again into pluripotent stem cells. So basically they took them from the bottom up, took them all the way up, and then you can de-differentiate skin cells or cardiac cells or something else into either very young skin cells or very young heart cells or any other cell in your body. So you can now take any one of your cells, deprogram it, create pluripotent stem cells, and eventually you can start applying CRISPR on this stuff to do things like build other wings on chickens, which is very useful if you own a sports bar. But it is also useful if you lose a leg. It is also useful if you lose an ear. And by the way, this technology from Cliff Haven's lab is now about 30 years old. So this was a gene called Sonic Hedgehog, because his child's favorite video game while Cliff was in the lab was Sonic Hedgehog. And then you go forward, you go to Tony Antello's lab, and he's working on about 32 different organs. And this technology is now about 10 to 20 years old. Well, it's been in clinical trials. Clinical trials take bloody forever. But if each of your cells knows how to make each of your body parts, each of your cells should know how to make 2 knees because you've already done that. 2 ears because you've already done that. A set of teeth because you've done that twice. 2 eyes because you've already done that. So your cell programming knows how to make your body parts. It's a question of how you express them. It's a question of how do you program the program that's already in there to express a particular function. So as you're thinking about this stuff, one of the things we did is we said, hey, that's really cool. What would happen if we took all the genes, DNA out of the cell, and inserted completely new DNA. And that little picture took us about $35 million in about 5 years, but we got it done. And you're looking at the world's first synthetic life form, called Cynthia, as in with an S, not with a C. And to prove we'd done it, one of the things we programmed in there was one of Robert Frost's poems. No good deed goes unpunished. The Robert Frost Foundation got very upset because we violated their copyright 1 billion times because this thing was produced 1 billion times. So we took it out, put together a new cell. And anyway, this was the Science Discovery of the Year, the cover of Science, the cover of Nature, the cover of 3,200 magazines, because that means you can now program life from scratch. It means you can take a cell and program it in the same way as you do a computer chip. So in the same way as you put ones and zeros into a computer chip, you can put DNA into a computer chip. And by the way, this is 2010. Right? So this is 15 years old. I'm not telling you today's news. So if you can program cells, that means that humans are directly and deliberately taking control of evolution. They're doing it in a nasty way, which is they're killing a lot of stuff. So when you take the weight of mammals on Earth and the number of mammals on Earth, 97% of them are what humans want and 3% of them are wild. Let me say that again. 3% of mammals are wild. Because we like chickens, we like pigs, we like cows, we like dogs, we like cats. We don't like wolves. We don't like lions if they're free. Right? So we kill a lot of stuff. And we take control of evolution in a negative way, but we also take control of evolution in a deliberate way. As we begin to program this stuff, and so one of the other companies we built allows you to have a build-at-home gene printer. So it's like a laser desk printer, but it prints out DNA. So things you can do is you can now build things where if you get the sequence of a pathogen, call it a COVID, which really should be called SARS, it shouldn't be called COVID, but if you get a SARS sequence, you can basically put the sequence into the machine and have a vaccine printed before the thing lands 12 hours later. And you can put sequence in an mRNA. And yes, you can try this at home. So that's why you're getting scalable pipelines for designing reconfigurable organisms in the same way as you can produce machines. And of course, all this stuff has been happening as people have said, yeah, the human genome that was passed. Except the cost curves on this stuff have been dropping very, very fast. Let me now walk into the long now portion of this, because this is what's happening in biology. But one of the more interesting trends that's happening, at least in my mind, and now I'm talking over the next 10 to 100 years, not thousands of years. What you've been looking at is what happened. Now we're going to go into what's happening and what's going to happen over the next 10 years. Is chemical evolution is also becoming electroevolution. Because we're beginning to understand life not just as chemicals, but also as electricity moving within the cells. And this stuff is pretty new. There's, those galvanic experiments and the previous stuff, but this stuff is moving in interesting ways these days. And the reason why it's interesting is because this is you, and the rest of it is just packaging. So when you begin to look at electrical impulses in the brain, you can model the brain in two ways. You can model it as a chemical system where dopamine is being released, and this is being released, and that's being released. And you can also model it as electrical charges that are spiking and interchanging. And you can have effects on the brain using chemicals, and you can have effects on the brain using electricity. And so the reason why this is interesting is because the limit to longevity has now become the brain. Because one of the things you saw is you can reproduce almost any one of your body parts. And you know that you can lose your body part and still remain you. If I take out a kidney, you're still you. If you lose an arm, You're still you. I take out your brain, I can legally kill you. Right? So that's you. The issue is we have no idea how to regrow brains at scale. We can do it in small things. We can do it in petri dishes. We can make organoids. We're testing medicines on organoids against things like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. But it's not enough to make the brain. You also have to download the data because otherwise you're not you. And that's what's going to be the limit to longevity. So don't believe any of these longevity truths around that. At least not now. So the thing that's interesting to me these days is neural interfaces. Because you're getting these electrical interfaces and electronic things that are placed outside or inside your brain to record or stimulate activity. And boy, does that raise some interesting questions. And these questions are real time because first, the number of transcranial stimulation trials is going through the roof. And because the first FDA transcranial stimulator was approved by the FDA, and this was this year. And it will be available as of the summer of 2026. And it looks pretty simple. Yes, you can try this at home. You don't have to go to the psychiatrist's office to treat your depression using an electroceutical, an FDA-approved electroceutical. And the effects, at least that they are claiming, read this paper before you believe all this data. There's a place right there where you can click to see the study. But the effects that they are claiming is the remission rates when tied to antidepressants are in the 67% range. So that's not a marginal effect. And this is company data, so big bowl of rice salt out here before read the paper, before you believe this and try it at home. But, it gives you a sense that at least some people are claiming electroceuticals are effective at scale, at home, for a relatively cheap treatment using electroceuticals. That's a different period, right? I mean, yes, we did have electroshock therapy. It wasn't solid, right? Then you get companies like this that are saying you can actually have personalized neuromodulation. And those companies live among you. So I would never dare show up at a long now talk without show and tell. And I didn't warn this person before she showed up. But it just so happens the CEO of this particular company is sitting right here. So Anna, why don't you tell us a little bit about your company?
I just came to see you. This is unfair. He didn't tell me, I have to admit, but as a good CEO, I always have my device with me. Because you never know when you're going to need that brain stimulation device. So let me wear it first, because if not, it's not show and tell. It's true that I always wear it with me all the time, anywhere I go. So, So as Juan mentions, this is both a non-invasive brain monitoring device. So as you can see, it's portable, it's easy to use. I have up to only 32 electrodes, and it can record my brain activity, my EEG, which you can find in many hospitals now for epilepsy, for sleep disorders, they will do an EEG, so I didn't invent this. But the beauty is that any electrode I have can inject currents into the brain, and you can cover the whole head. So I agree with flow. I think that flow is a good example of transcranial stimulation for mental health, because TMS has been out there for a time and it works and it's approved. But I also think that, to your point, the brain is so complex that I would love to see a future where diseases are targeted depending on your circuits. So if you have depression and your symptom is anhedonia or mood disorder, the circuits that are affected are probably different. So can we target specifically in your personalized way, this circuitry? using 8 electrodes here and 8 here and personalize the current. So that's what we are doing with a computational neuroscience model of the brain. But what I wanted to tell you today is that I'm very lucky that I scaled my company from Barcelona to Boston, where I have my investors and a lot of my activity. And we are 8 weeks from the readout of our phase 3 clinical trial with the FDA to use non-invasive brain stimulation for epilepsy. First time in history that, thank you, I hope it goes well, I hope it goes well. But, imagine all the patients suffering from epilepsy that don't respond to medication and the only alternative is surgery. Huge population of patients that the only alternative they have is implanted or craniotomy. So we aim to become this first company to go through the FDA. I hope that our data is positive, but that's the price of science, right? It can go bad or good. And then the EEG can read this epilepsy, right, and then stimulate. So that's kind of our goal for the future, and we are very excited to share the news, especially in Boston, of our clinical trial in 8 weeks. And I'm happy to answer any question before I go out of my show and tell, or to answer any question you have.
Anybody have an immediate question?
Is this for, so this is for epilepsy and possibly also for depression? Are those the main uses, or are there other uses?
Well, we started with epilepsy, which is already very hard, and our second indication would be mental health, depression, and I think it has also, we have some pilot data in neurodegeneration, cognitive decline, similar to the alpha, to the gamma stimulation paradigms that some companies in Boston are doing with flickering lights. We think we can stimulate also gamma in the brain with electrical current. So those are kind of like the three indication, but it's early days for the others as well.
Patty?
For epilepsy, would you have to wear this all the time so that if you might get a seizure at that moment, you can get stimulation, or is it something that you would do sort of independently from that to change things more permanently?
It's a great question. We could do closed loop, but then the patient will need to wear this 24/7. So what we are doing is asking them to wear this 20 minutes every day, and the protocol for the FDA is 10 days. We are doing children, so the FDA required our patients to go to the hospital, but we had 0 adverse events with 210 patients stimulated, so we hope that the FDA will let us send the patients home with this device, and they have to do 10 days over 2 weeks, and then the effects fade off, and you have to repeat that after a month. So it's not permanent. You need to keep on bringing stimulation to the brain so that seizures don't occur.
I'm going to take one more. Your choice. Well, we're also going to have questions on the end.
Just to contextualize this, how is this impacting a long view in terms of evolution? Like, isn't this like a slice into just one organism and then an intervention and then a fix? How does this deal?
Perfect question. Let me take that.
Yes. Okay.
We're going to bring them out at the end, and she's going to correct all the barbarities I'm about to say, but this is the right question, which is, okay, now what? So what? Okay, so now you're beginning to understand how you can stimulate the brain and apply electricity to different parts of the brain to have different outcomes. And that, thank goodness, is potentially going to help solve non-treatable epilepsy in young children. Very good thing to do. How long have you been at this?
Forever.
It takes a long time.
2011.
But, this is for various therapies. And again, this is on this company. This isn't just epilepsy. It's potentially other stuff. So then you'd have to ask yourself, what other things might people be thinking about treating? And are there any other people out there doing it? And the answer is, yep. Turns out there are a bunch of people who are not being as careful as I'm not, and they're selling this as DIY. So you have a slice that's going through clinical trials, and then you've got a slice that's going DIY. And that's an interesting question, right? How do you think about that? And then you've got the Journal of Psychiatry in last year saying, hey, maybe we can treat opioid addiction through this stuff. And then you've got people sitting out there saying, Maybe we can reduce your desire to drink alcohol. And this is very interesting because what it's telling you is it's not telling you that you have an aversion to alcohol. It's not that you dislike alcohol, it's just you don't feel the need to drink it. And then you've got somebody out here saying, maybe we can do something with sex. Who knew that technology would ever be applicable to sex? Or anybody would want to apply new technologies to sex? Never heard of that. And then there are people who are saying, maybe we could boost attention and memory by doing this, and focus concentration. And then there are some people out there saying, oh, by the way, when you run these clinical trials, you get a real difference in how men and women react to these treatments. That's interesting. And most of these studies, because of FDA constraints, have been at very low power. So fear not. These nice people in November of 2025 said, hey, we're going to go out and see if we have a little bit, it's good. How about if we have much more? So they're beginning to put in high-dose treatments for depressive disorders and for other treatments. So you've been having a very mild set of and these folks are saying, hey, come on. And then we did a study, which I was a part of at the National Academy of Medicine, saying, if this stuff is coming through, are there any ethical implications to this stuff? Is there anything we might want to think about with this stuff? So as we did this, we thought, a series of case studies. So what happens if you are severely depressed in Australia, you're taking this treatment, it works, and your job moves to the United States and you can't get that treatment because it isn't approved? Or what happens if you get one of these things and it allows you as an adult to concentrate more, but then it turns out that your child also finds it useful and begins to use it? And what happens if it's an over-the-counter drug, or not drug, over-the-counter electroceutical? What happens as this stuff becomes DIY? What happens as this stuff becomes faster, better, cheaper? How do you think about these things? So we spent a couple of years thinking about this and published a report on this stuff. And then there's the whole issue of the values that are implied in the use of this, as well as in the use of AI. So there's some pretty explicit trade-offs that you want to understand when you use things that alter the brain or things that change the way you think, like AI. And some of the trade-offs you might want to look like is, are there any hidden values in this stuff that patients aren't thinking about? How would you think about prescribing this if the difference is maximizing revenue versus minimizing cost? How do you think about this stuff if it's respecting patient autonomy versus preventing harm? How do you think about this stuff if it's aggressive intervention versus conservative management? And all these things are implied in how you program AI and also in how you program and implement brain-altering devices and the programs that are going to be behind those brain-altering devices. So we're going to have a big meeting at a seminar. We're going to bring together about 300 people in about 2 weeks to try and put together some guidelines for emerging brain technologies before some of these things become issues. And we'll have about a third entrepreneurs, we'll have about a third investors, and then we'll have a whole bunch of ethicists and academics and other folks and have a grand old time drinking mezcal by the sea. This stuff is becoming DIY in really interesting ways, right? Because you're beginning to get brain-computer interfaces, and again, we have an expert who, if you'd like to, Patty, you can talk about some of this stuff at the end, or not talk about some of the stuff at the end. But, there's stuff going on at the Media Lab that's real-time, that's really interesting in this stuff. Because you start with a BCI, brain-computer interface, with somebody who's paralyzed, thinking about how to move a wheelchair, how to speak, how to communicate with loved ones, how to do daily tasks. But of course, once you get past that, then you can also begin using BCI for things like playing video games.
Relieving pain. Relieving pain.
Relieving pain,
Posture.
yeah, that will probably be a really important use. And in fact, this particular company, its three first uses: a smart system for meditation and sleep, an interface sleep device, and a neurofeedback solution for athletes, wellness signatures, stressed employees. And so yes, some of these things we'll begin to think about calming you, taking out stress. I am sure there are trials out there for relieving pain. I didn't find them in the time that I was preparing this, but I will look at that in much more detail because that's an obvious issue, right? Oh, by the way, it turns out there's another guy here who's part of our community that you really have to pay attention to called Mike Levin, who's sitting at Tufts. And he's one of the smartest guys out there. And he's thinking about how electrical instructions shape bodies. So he can take flatworms and cut them in certain ways. And flatworms, when you cut them, they grow a head and a tail. So if you cut off the head, the tail grows a head. If you take the head, it grows a tail, and you can do that like a couple hundred times. It's just crazy stuff. It regenerates. He's now beginning to think of, okay, if you apply electricity here, then you grow 3 heads. So some of this stuff is really spooky and interesting. And what that's telling you is that bioelectricity can also alter how organisms are made, how organisms are shaped. It's not just the genome that's doing it. So you're going to see a whole bunch of really interesting medical changes and treatments coming out of bioelectric stuff, and it ain't just going to be in the brain. So here's a question for all of you. All of us are so happy with what Facebook has done, and what X has done, and what TikTok has done, and how it's helped young people, right? And they did that by making these things deliberately addictive. And there are arguments that they knew they were making these things deliberately addictive. And the TikTok is like crack on this stuff. And so what they did is they created an attention economy, allegedly. And in allegedly creating an attention economy, they sucked up people's time. So people are not going outside, people are not reading books, people are showing up at college classes, not able to read, forget about a book, a chapter. And AI may accelerate that, right? So there's been a whole economy built around stay here longer so we can advertise more products to you. And the really interesting question is what happens when an attention economy becomes an affection economy? So all of a sudden you have an AI girlfriend or an AI boyfriend. And there is a big incentive to keep you enthralled, excited, delighted with your effective partner. And what happens if you begin to put AI and your data and an AI company together with a cat that makes you feel things? Pleasure, no pain, attraction, sexual excitement. Huh. We might want to think about some of that stuff, which is part of the reason why we're doing a soul mark. Who sets the rules and what should be the rules? Because this stuff is moving pretty quickly, right? And as you're thinking about this stuff, now let me talk about the last part of this, which is the long map stuff. Now we're getting into 1,000 years, close to the next few years. If you take direct and deliberate control over evolution, and you do it over all living beings, and then you begin to use electricity to mimic or alter living beings or substitute for living beings, could you see a period in 100 years or 1,000 years where intelligence will be based not on chemical interactions, but on electric interactions? And knowledge will be carried through electricity, not through chemicals. So if you could model a brain, you could model it as a wet sponge or you can model it as a bunch of electrical impulses. And if you could do that, the impact would actually be kind of cool, because it means that instead of having to consume 2,000 calories a day and protect the body from radiation, you could basically carry your brain in a silicon chip across space in about something this size. And if you believe AI, then you can carry all human brains in something about this size in an evolving fashion across very long distances, not consuming a lot of calories, many of which you could get from various stars you pass. So if you are going to take control of evolution, then the question becomes, how do you want to model brains? And how do you want the evolution of the human brain to move? Would you want to try and grow a brain twice the size, so you have twice the processing capacity? Or would you rather model it as an electrical system as opposed to an electrochemical system? And again, I'm getting into long now, taking control over evolution, highly speculative. I have no articles to cite, just a question. And so as you're thinking about that, how is AI evolving? Well, AI's evolutionary tree actually looks to me like some of the early COVID trees, where you start getting subspecies looking at different fitness landscapes evolving very quickly. And it turns out that some of the AIs may be doing this, and you may have either a convergence of AI, or you may have a divergence in AI of intelligence. And there are real consequences to AI collapsing into a kind of common intelligence, enormously eliminating a variety, which is partly what's happening in your Google results, where instead of getting 10 or 20 results on one page, you're getting one, and a lot of people are going on the first one. And it begins to create a kind of a group think. And by the way, Wikipedia can also do that for students. I love Wikipedia, by the way. I want to support Wikipedia, but you begin to get a common narrative. Or it can begin to break the stuff apart and have very different answers for very, very different queries. And what happens with that in evolutionary terms is a really important question. Like a really interesting question. So what happens as you evolve greater intelligence in robots? Right? There are people like Daniel LaRousse who have created things like liquid AI that is beginning to think about what happens if we collapse AI into manageable chunks that can guide robots. So you don't have to go back to the server. And you don't have to build these giant servers. Right? And that's a really interesting question. If liquid AI is supported, so what happens if this begins to evolve in these directions? And so our time is up. And that is why you should ask yourself, did Darwin write the same books? And that's the update on the book I wrote on evolving ourselves, redesigning the future of humanity one gene at a time.